R and other packages will give you a better flexibility, and then hopefully you'll be more accurate with your data analysis. Having said that, like once you learn to use the program and you understand what it's good at and what it's bad at, like go for it. Like don't let it stop you. And a lot of using stats is becoming familiar with one program so that you actually use it, and so that you collect data that you can analyze in that kind of traditional canonical fashion.
I'm just curious. Do like scientists just use like the program R like most?
Yes, they've largely moved to R. There are some dedicated stats software too that certain labs prefer and use, and that's pretty common. Again, in different fields, different research groups, that are studying starfish biology or that are really into genetics. Like they'll develop certain programs that analyze their data well and that they have workflows for, and then that spreads through their community because they write papers about it and they're like, hey, if you do this, it gets fast, it gets easy, it gives you great results. Then other lab groups will pick up those types of packages. And so bioinformatics, this type of study of analyzing data, is actually one of the fastest growing fields in biology. The ability to analyze data well is now that we can get a lot of data, we have to learn how to analyze it better. And that the traditional statistical methods don't always work well and quickly in a timely fashion for really big data sets. That's kind of fun. I had several undergraduate students during my postdoc that I worked with that were interested in this type of data analysis. Like they were never going to be or interested in being bench scientists, but they were really enamored with biological data. And they found that they could use their computer information background in order to answer biological questions. And that was like a huge fulfillment for them. Like they don't have to go into software development. Or if they do go into software development, it's for this particular purpose of how do we mine genomic data to find cures for cancer. It's like, that's totally cool.
Do you learn how to code too?
Yes, exactly. And so there's a real marriage between information science and being comfortable with coding and the user interface of your computer and being actually able to analyze your data. And lots of times it means that you don't ever have to leave your nice comfy office space in order to write scientific papers and analyze data. Again, something that appeals to lots of people. Okay, what's the other thing you need to do for tomorrow? Not only are we going to meet in the computer lab, but what do you need to be prepared to talk about? The article about sharks. Yeah. I'll give you guys a choice when we come in the lab tomorrow. We're going to meet at 10:10 over in Peter Jones 116. I'll give you a choice if you want to start with the math stuff or you want to talk about the paper first. But we'll spend about an hour and a half on each of them.
Is there regarding? We also have to have a research question kind of narrowed down.
Yeah, I'd love for you to have a research question that you can either tell me about if you have questions about it. Is this going to work? Or send it to me an email at the end of class, and I can take some ideas off you in the coming week.
Is there a place where we can kind of look up some similar research questions or base your stuff off of? Or
I would say that
guidelines online and like a
yeah. So on Blackboard, above in the learning module section, above our current table, this is where the slides are and homework assignments. I put some documents about writing scientific papers. And the first one of those, the one that's like introduction and advice, deals with hypothesis generation.
Okay.
And so let me make sure it's on there, but you could rip one of those questions right off.
Gotcha.
They're there for you to kind of read and see questions other people have asked.
Okay.
Yeah. Those resources are really great because they'll tell you about how to write an introduction and they'll give you 3 or 4 examples.
Okay.
And it's oh look, I can do that. It's a good little manual. It's very old, as you will see when you look at it. The advice doesn't go bad. Okay, we're going to continue talking about competition. We left off class on Tuesday, I think it's Thursday today, talking about the actual mechanisms of competition that happen within organisms and species. So we talked about the effects of competition, decreased survival, decreased growth, decreased reproduction for individuals. What actually causes that is the mechanisms of competition that we were talking about. And so what were the two mechanisms we had already talked about that can cause decreased survival, reproduction, and growth? So like what causes?
What causes the what? Decreased survival?
Yeah, like what causes there to be decreased survival or reproduction? We talked about two of these things.
Competition.
Stress.
Stress. Okay, competition causes stress.
Oh,
And then
okay,
causes
that was a
hormonal
bit-
changes that lead to decreased growth, lead to
Okay.
decreased reproduction.
What I missed that.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think you were out of the room.
I wrote hormonal changes. That's not good.
Yeah. So stress. What else did we talk about? Social behavior, which we're going to start today. And there was one other one before we jump into social behavior. Increases dispersal. Got it. Okay. So we're going to start here by talking about altered social behavior in that last slide again, and then we're going to talk about territoriality. Bless you. Which is the other big competition mechanism, is that it causes territoriality, which has these consequences on organisms. We'll look at the kind of interesting effect that happens when we have small population sizes, and then we'll see if we can get into talking about inter-species competition. And both on the opening slide here, where we have the hyenas and the lions, and here in the slide here, where we've got anemones and sea stars and mussels and clams all battling for space. That's inter-species competition between two different species. And there's some really cool math that helps us quantify inter-species competition. Okay, so one of these mechanisms of competition is that it alters social behaviors in organisms that then leads to usually either slower growth rates or delayed reproduction and changes in reproductive cycles. And so we see that when we have more intense competition, organisms get more aggressive. They are going to be more territorial. They are less tolerant of individuals around them, which can push them to disperse. We often see then that dominance in certain types of organisms persists as their hierarchical unit of defining who can and cannot reproduce. And that's the case with the case of the naked mole rats, where the queen of the colony then limits the reproductive capacity of other females underneath her. They're sexually mature. They have genes that they could pass on to the next generation, but she prevents that. What this altered social behavior serves to do then is to limit the number of individuals in the area. It helps to stabilize population size. On an individual basis, it affects growth, reproduction, overall mortality rate. If you get pushed out into a less grouped territory, if you get pushed out of a colony, you're more likely to be predated.
Is there like a king rat too?
There is, but the female often mates with several different males. And so there may be a dominant male, but it's not to the same extent that we see.
How did it become like the
I love how I always ask you all these random questions about
No, I love it
experience.
too. I would much rather talk about the ins and outs of naked mole rat society. Lost Voltaire equations of interspecific competition, because it is more interesting and it has slightly more real life value. But they're cool organisms, and naked mole rats, we often see them at zoos, right? Colonies. Same type of thing happens in like prairie dogs, in gophers, in marmots. Any of these colonial small mammal semi-rodent species will have this type of dominance usually, where there's one sexually reproducing female that then controls essentially the colony growth. I don't know how it got to be females. Same thing in meerkats. Although they're a little less like catty about it.
they can come over and eat the babies?
All right. Another example of altered social behavior with competition comes in wolves, and we have actually some pretty amazing studies in wolves as we reintroduce them to the American West. And that as the wolves are reintroduced to Yellowstone and as they have spread out in territory, we've been able to observe really interesting social pack behavior in these organisms. And as their numbers have increased, they have experienced more intense competition for territory. And this comes as an increased aggression between packs, fighting over the best territory mostly to hunt elk, which have been the dominant prey species for them. It varies just a little bit who leaves. Remember we said that dispersal can be juveniles or dispersal can be adults. And we have found that in wolves, if they're in high density, high competition, the subadults are pushed out, which is kind of what you see in this picture here. And the subadults are more likely to die because they don't have the pack to support them. They don't have the experience to be a hunter or to begin a pack. And thus they're more likely to die because of those less experienced factors. And that pushing out of subadults then stabilizes population size. Under high competition, it helps to enforce carrying capacity by pushing out individuals who then die and reduce population size and lower reproductive capacity in the future. Under low density, we see that adults tend to be the ones that leave packs, and they go off to inhabit new territory in order to start their own pack, in order to take advantage of resources to reproduce. This establishes packs, allows the wolves to spread across greater geographic range, and overall that under low density conditions, dispersal leads to increases in population size when it's the adults that leave the pack, essentially kind of their own volition. They're definitely encouraged to go. It's not like the wolves run after the adults as they're leaving. They're like, come back to the pack, help me raise my offspring. But they're more likely to succeed when they leave as adults. And adults are more likely to leave in low density instances. Adults tend to stay in packs under high density conditions because they recognize that there's a chance that the adult dominant pair, one or the other will die. And then they have a chance to become the alpha male or female with the reproductive rights and success that the rest of the pack moves to. And so it's to the advantage of the adults to stay in established pack because they might gain access to the resources as the dominant organism. And along the way, they're often helping a brother or a sister to reproduce, which means that some of their genes are being passed on to the next generation.
I think in a couple slides back, you said that competition increases dispersal, but it doesn't stop overpopulation.
Right. It depends on who leaves. And if it's the breeding individuals that leave, it can help stabilize population size. If it's the subadults who aren't breeding in some instances, it will not help with population.
Okay.
Like it just increases the range of territory. It doesn't actually change population size. If those subadults leave and die, then it does help to stabilize population. It just depends upon who leaves and if they live or not, and you actually expand territory.
Okay.
So it's a fine point.
That is
All right. The last thing that competition does as a mechanism is that it increases territoriality. And territoriality, of course, is defense of a home range. It is defense of a territory. And these two words sometimes are synonymous with each other in that the home range is the territory, and in some cases, the home range is a subset of territory, or vice versa. A home range is an area that an organism uses during the year for growth and reproduction. And so your home range might include your summer breeding grounds and your winter overwintering grounds where it's warmer and there's more food available year round. Your home range might include an actual area that you defend from other organisms of your same species or similar species using. It gives you a resource base that is yours. For some organisms, they really stridently defend their home range and that becomes a territory. For things like migrating songbirds, like migrating whales and seals and sea turtles, their home range is not a territory that they defend. It is a habitat that they utilize. What we see very clearly in our studies is that bigger animals, carnivores, males, adults, require larger home ranges in order to sustain themselves. They have a larger habitat footprint. And that's the data that we see here, that we're looking at a log scale here of body mass. As body mass increases for all these different categories of organisms, the home range, the habitat that they utilize also increases. Why?
more mass.
Why does more mass matter for home range?
More resources.
Yeah, they need more resources. You need more food. You need more actual water. You need more places to poop, okay? Like, it takes more area to give you the resources and to deal with your waste the bigger you are. You have bigger metabolic needs, and so you need a bigger base of the pyramid to support you. Why is it that kind of warm-blooded organisms need usually a bigger home range?
They usually use a lot of energy to acquire.
Yeah, they need more energy in order to maintain a constant body temperature, and thus they have a bigger resource book. So again, endothermic organisms that have to maintain a constant body temperature tend to need a bigger home range than ectothermic cold-blooded organisms that their body temperature parallels and kind of changes without their body. Okay. A question from the end of chapter 11, how does this relationship between body size and home range affect our techniques for measuring population abundance and density?
Gives you a guideline on how to start off.
Yeah.
If you're like measuring rodents, you're gonna kind of, if you're doing like a grizzly or something.
Yeah, exactly. And that our expectation of how dense organisms are going to be, our expectation of the area that we need to be looking in can be informed by some of this like basic science about the relationships between organisms and home range and territories. That if you know something about the life history of your organism, you know something about its metabolic needs, then you can adjust your measuring techniques for that. You know, if you want to measure the population of squirrels in a forest, like you can look in a pretty small portion of the forest to do a market capture. But if you want to, again, look at something like grizzly bears, like you've got to be looking in a much larger area to get an adequate sampling of grizzly bears. Okay, cool. All right, a territory then is a defended home range where the organisms have exclusive access to the resources. So a home range is the area that an organism utilizes for resources and growth and survival. If you defend that home range, it becomes your territory. And we see that territories then are linked to contest and exclusion competition strategies. In that by defending a territory, you win the contest for those resources. You have exclusive right to them. You're excluding others from access to those resources. Organisms use all types of behaviors and techniques in order to defend their territory. So we see that, of course, songbirds have calls and vocalizations. This happens in all kinds of different mammals as well as fish and amphibians. They will make a vocalization in order to indicate, I am here. I am a certain size. I'm a certain species. I'm a certain gender. Come or get out of the way. We see lots of different organisms do intimidation displays. So the two fish here are sarcastic blennies. They're these little fish that live in these little sand burrows, and they can open their jaws to the side in order to have a bigger mouth. And they use this then to display and kind of attack the blennies in the little burrows around them to defend their territory for resources and nesting space. So they look totally weird for fish when they open their mouths. Otherwise, they look just like a normal little guppy fish when their mouth is closed. Here we have the bear that is doing a scent marking. It says S-E-N-T. It should be S-C-E-N-T there in order to mark his territory. And by depositing oil from glands or musk from anal glands or even just feces and urine, you can indicate, I'm here, I'm of this particular gender, I'm of this particular age, I'm at this point in my reproductive cycle. Stay out and get away, or you are welcome to come in.
It's like a bear's Tinder.
Oh yeah, totally. That's weird. They do it in springtime. In one of the Planet Earth ones, I think it's the Mountain Planet Earth 2, there is this hilarious montage of bears like rubbing themselves on trees. And it's great. It has awesome background music. In plants, they send out lots of pheromones. They send out lots of these volatile aromatic compounds to be chemical cues about territory. They do it in the air. They can do it underground. They can have it carried by water. And they can mark territory in ways that seem very different from these other types of displays and attacks and aggressive behaviors that we associate with more mobile organisms.
Did you say plants?
Yeah.
What are they gonna do? It's like, oh, stop drilling towards me. You better stop.
Yeah, and so they'll put out toxic chemicals in their roots to other members of the same species.
Oh, okay.
And so that prevents them from growing. Like that defends your territory. Lots of times they'll use these types of aromatics. We'll see it again when we talk about predation. And that a plant will release an aromatic compound when it's under attack by beetles or an herbivore, and that then causes other members of the same species to close their leaves. So they'll be less prone to attack. Or they'll produce toxic compounds, receiving those aromatic cues, so that when the predator comes over to them, the other plant, they won't eat as much. It's like one dies in defense of everybody else. It is totally cool, because you're like, plants just sit there. They respond to stimuli. All right. The way that territoriality works as a competition mechanism is not just contest and exclusion competition, but the total area that's available will kind of define how many individuals of the population can be present. And so the total area divided by the average number or the average size of a territory defines how many breeding pairs or packs or how many individuals of the population can be there. It automatically sets a mechanism for carrying capacity for maximum population size. In almost all populations, we see that there are excess individuals beyond what there's territory space available. And these excess individuals that don't have territories are known as floaters. Okay. And floaters have different relationships in different species. Some of them are important sources of gene flow and movement and migration between subpopulations in a larger population. Sometimes floaters are actually the ones that end up I hate to say fathering, sometimes it's mothering. They end up being the actual gene contributors most to the next generation, because they can fly around or move around and mate with everybody. They don't have to stay and take care of any kids. And so they end up kind of disproportionately adding genes to the next generation. But if territory opens up, we see that these floaters in populations where they exist will really quickly establish into new territories. In this way, territoriality influences the spatial distribution of individuals in a population. And so in the experiment that's diagrammed here, which is done with these beautiful little songbirds in Europe known as the greater tit, they took out individuals from territories, and then they came back a few weeks later, and the floaters had established new territories where space was opened up in the home range. And again, it's not always the same spot. And definitely some of the established pairs expanded their territory into what had opened up, but then it also allowed the floater pairs to establish. Okay, does this make sense to everybody?
So you're not a floater by choice. You're just...
No, and usually you are a subadult who is waiting to reach sexual maturity, and that you have to wait for an established breeding pair to lose a mate. Or to die, both of them, before you can hop into the territory.
Gotcha.
And that's usually what happens. It's usually life cycle dependent. That you spend some time as a floater, and then assuming you survive as a floater, you'll get a territory sooner or later. Doesn't always happen. And again, if the organisms are long-lived and they have really restrictive ranges, you may never get a territory. You may spend your whole life as a floater. And again, like there are different relationships for different species on how you actually do sometimes get to pass on your genes quite heavily in comparison to defenders and territories. All right, territoriality can influence population size and growth rate when reproductive age individuals are denied territory. And so if you have individuals in the population that can reproduce but don't have a territory, they won't. And that can serve to stabilize population size. It affects your individual fecundity and your reproduction if you can't get a territory in which to breed. The other thing we tend to see is that when population density gets high, okay, the actual territory size declines. That's the top graph. As population density next per hectare, again, we're looking at this great tit songbird, gets high, their territory size decreases. And this then affects the growth rate of individuals in the territory because they have less access to resources because they have a smaller territory. It affects their reproductive rate because they have less resources, they will raise fewer successful offspring. And that's what we see here is that effect on overall fecundity, that as the density of breeding pairs gets higher in these songbirds, their clutch size, the number of offspring and eggs they lay and raise, gets much lower too. And that when territory size is high and density is low, they can support bigger clutches, they can have more offspring. But when density gets high and territory size gets low, they end up having fewer babies. It's one of these very density dependent mechanisms. This means that at high density, a shrinking territory will influence survival, it'll influence growth rate, it'll influence individual reproductive rate. Those three things, the consequences of high competition. The mechanism here is territoriality. It's defense of the home range. Okay, plants do this too, as I've mentioned. And that plants, of course, need to occupy and hold a territory in order to gain access to resources. And again, it's a little bit different for plants. You know, we're talking about not just nutrient resources in water, but also light resources. And for plants, when we consider territoriality, we're talking about a zone of resource depletion that they need to have access to both above and below ground. And again, there's kind of different purposes here for why they need territory than in the case of our vertebrate and invertebrate organisms. Very often in plants, when you see a uniform distribution of individuals across the landscape, there's kind of even spacing between them, that's a result of territoriality. There is a defined region that can support an individual. As they get more dense, the territories shrink and they'll get closer together, but there's still kind of an even amount of space between them. This data is pretty interesting because it shows that as there's more water in the soil, you can support a higher density of plants. Because in a given area, a given plant will get more water. When soil moisture goes down, the spacing between individuals gets bigger because they need to hold a larger territory in order to gain access to enough moisture. So between dry years and wet years, you can see a change in the density and the spacing between organisms in these types of populations. In years of resource plenty, they can be closer packed together and still be able to get resources than in years when there are less resources available. This is one reason why when going to the rainforest, you often see that there's a high richness and density of tree or plant species, but there's great distances between individuals of the same species. Because they need a big resource base in order to support themselves, particularly for plants when it comes to soil quality. That there's there's very rapid decomposition and little soil nutrient regeneration before it gets washed out, and thus you can only support so many individuals per given area. All right, I have a question for you. Okay, in considering territoriality, what condition must hold true for territoriality to actually function as a density-dependent mechanism to regulate population growth in your state?
Resources.
Yeah,
A finite amount of resources.
Good. There has to be a finite amount of resources, and that finite amount indicates and implies that there's an excess of individuals in the population. And that's the kind of condition that has to hold for this to be true. When there are more individuals than territory, then somebody loses competition and population will be affected. Okay. Territory size can easily affect individuals. Doesn't have a population effect until you have floaters, until you have more individuals in the population than you have resources. I think
planes can't eat floaters.
No, it doesn't work real well. And that's a very interesting scenario where sometimes seed germination can be delayed in plants by these types of compounds that are put out by adult plants. And then when the adult dies, then the seeds of the same species are able to germinate. And again, whoever wins rapid growth and competition will be the winner of that territory. But yeah, otherwise they tend to stay dormant. And again, it really varies species to species and what's possible. Okay, I want to talk about what happens at low population numbers. So competition is definitely something that's density dependent, and we think about competition impacts on populations and individuals happening at high density, at high competition interactions. For many organisms, though, there is a minimum amount of interaction that they must sustain within members of their own population to function as a population, to be a species. And this gives us really interesting nonlinear effects at small population densities, at small population densities. So you may remember from our graphs of population growth that in both exponential and in our logistic population growth, there's this lag when you have small populations before it really kicks off and starts growing quickly. That's the Ali effect, okay? For most populations, there's some minimum number that's necessary to really sustain the population and get it going. And there's lots of reasons why small populations can have problems sustaining themselves. But we see that there can be density-dependent negative impacts at small population sizes, just as there can be density-dependent negative impacts at high population sizes. And so here, we are looking at kind of normal linear death rates. You get lots of deaths when you get high population sizes. You should get lower mortality rates at low population sizes. But if we kind of look at birth rates decline at high population sizes because of competition and this impact on growth and fecundity, but birth rates also really go down at low population sizes in this nonlinear fashion to death. And it's this lack of birth and reproduction at low population densities that causes the okay. It means that populations that are small grow really slow and can have still pretty high relative mortality rates, which is bad for them. The Ali effect is defined that at low population sizes and densities, birth rates decline, but mortality remains high or increases. And as a result, population growth overall becomes negative because you're losing more individuals than you're replacing in the population. And if you are an endangered species, this is really problematic. In that once you get a small enough population size, you can be subject to the Ali effect, and then there's very little that conservation biologists or the public can do in order to bring your population back. You're stuck in this feedback loop that we're going to call an extinction vortex. Okay, so the Ali effect is that these negative effects at small population sizes, birth rates decline, death rate stays pretty high, and as a result, the population growth is negative. Okay, why? Okay, first and foremost, we see that birth rates decline in small populations because it's hard to find a mate. And that is just because unlikely that you are going to find a mate that you can actually have fertilization, that you can find a mate that you can successfully raise offspring with. And that as your density gets low, there's a greater and greater distance between you and members of your same species. And if you are a wind or a water or a small insect pollinated plant species, they might not make it to take your pollen to the next plant over. It's too far. Okay, it just doesn't happen. And thus there's it's not anything that you did, it's just that you never met another member of your species, and so you both died without reproducing. Tragic. Makes a great bio documentary, but it happens. What we see here is data from wild ginseng, and we see that the fruits produced per plant go way down when the number of flowering plants goes way down. Okay, it's not a straight line relationship, it's one of these arcs way down. As the distance between plants increases, there's just not a good chance that pollen is going to be transferred fertilization to take place, even if you have farm adult plants in the population. It tends to affect plants and insects a lot because these are organisms that can't travel far and are dependent upon other resources for fertilization. It can happen in mammals too. When your territories are widely spaced, you may just never run into each other. You may never know that there is a receptive female or suitable mate in your home range because your territories are so far apart. The other thing that tends to happen at low population sizes is that any social interactions necessary for your reproductive effort break down. And this is a case of what happened in the Vancouver Island marmots, which are this gorgeous little rodent that is listed here in our picture. What happened with the Vancouver Island marmots, there are subspecies of marmots in Canada that just live on this one relatively large island off the coast of British Columbia. And they have had habitat destruction, and so that they've lost habitat range. And as a result, their population numbers have gone down. And because of a declining population, then each little colony of marmots has fewer individuals in it. And as a result, the individuals in the colony spend most of their time gathering food and defending from predators. And there's no time left to raise kids. If there are more adults in the colony, some of them are gathering food, some of them are defending against predators, some of them are having and taking care of babies. Individually, they have to find food and defend themselves before they can reproduce. Because they spend all their time defending their territory and looking for predators, they never have time to actually reproduce. And so even though there are marmots and there are colonies, their birth rate is very, very low. Yeah, that's the case of the Vancouver Island marmots. That's why they're a threatened species.
So there's only fewer marmots.
They went from an average colony size of between 10 and 20 individuals to an average colony size of, I think, 5 to 7 individuals. And at that small colony size, they just can't manage to raise offspring.
But there's like a lot of colonies in the.
Yeah, but they're too small to actually raise successfully offspring.
They have a bunch of individually small colonies.
Why don't they
It's
move
like-
all the colonies?
So, yeah, so that's what conservation efforts then focus on, is capturing one colony and causing it to merge with another. The difficulty there comes from territoriality, in that they want to move into the neighboring territory that has lots of resources. They don't think to themselves, they just go, look, there's lots of food. And they like run over and start a colony, not thinking like, oh, but I'm not gonna have any time to have babies. Like, they're not like that intelligent. And so in order for this to work, you have to really like pin them and cause them to be confined in larger colonies, which works, but it also is much more intensive, and it introduces an artificial barrier to normal marmot life. I'm real concerned about that. Okay. With the ALIA effect, then, we can start to become aware of and concerned with minimum viable population size, or MVP. It's football season. It's World Series season. We have lots of MVP guys running around and gals. But this is a different terminology. The minimum viable population size is the number of individuals that are needed to sustain long-term survival of a population or species. And it is a very important number to know and to be assessing for in conservation biology and in environmental science. When we have threatened or endangered species that we know already exist at small population sizes, we want to know what is the minimum population size they can get to and still make it as a species. And when they get below MVP, then we need to like step in and like do something. Okay, that's when we need to like move them from threatened to endangered. That's when we need to hit the button on taking a bunch of them into captivity and trying to rear a bunch in captivity to release into the wild. There are more precise definitions of MVP, particularly in conservation biology. MVP is the smallest isolated population that has a 99% chance to survive for 1,000 years or 40 generations, despite random environmental and demographic changes, which is stochastic. It's the idea that what is the minimum viable population size to withstand genetic drift? When we have these random wipeouts of some genetic diversity, how small can the population be before it doesn't experience a genetic bottleneck. And so it plays into an understanding of evolution and life history of a species as to what minimum viable population size. Northern elephant seals were reduced by overhunting to a population of about 200 individuals in the early 1900s. There's now over 200,000 northern elephant seals due to protection from hunting. They're all descended from those 200 elephant seals. Seems okay. Like they've managed to increase their population size. There might be something lurking in their genetics though that is going to come back and cause them to die off, semi-randomly, it would appear to us in the future. And that's really concerning. Like they probably went way below minimum viable population size in terms of genetic diversity. Personally, I would not like to eat elephant seal, but it used to be a fine table.
Pandas, they're all, are they all on the endangered species?
Pandas? Is that what you guys?
Yeah, pandas,
Yes, they are.
they're good, or they're all?
No, they're still on it. China has done an amazing job of being able to breed and successfully raise panda newborns. And a lot of that has involved having pandas in captivity have babies and then like hand rearing the panda babies.
Don't like the mother only like accepts one child?
Yeah, she often has
And
twins.
just switch it up.
Oh yeah, and they'll like switch them back and forth
To, like-
in order to make sure that
Yeah.
she keeps lactating and feeds them both. Like they have got it down to like a perfect science.
Yeah.
All
And
right.
they get cute online videos of all these panda cubs running around, and it's totally awesome. The difficulty they have then is reintroducing those pandas to the wild.
Yeah.
And that's now that they've like figured out how to get pandas to reproduce, now they have to, yeah, exactly. Like now they have to get the pandas back into the wild. And that's where I would say that in captivity, pandas are doing fine. In the wild, pandas are pretty much functionally extinct. Like there are not enough of them in the wild to do their like ecosystem service, to actually be predated upon by anything in a substantial fashion. And so China, in these breeding facilities, their next step is to figure out what type of conservation habitat they need in order to reintroduce these captive bred pandas into the wild, so that they're able to feed themselves, they don't run up to people in cars, and get hit or taken in as pets, and that they can avoid predators on their own. And then we can put them back in the mountain ranges and the bamboo stands where they should be. We can't do that yet until they can like fend for themselves. And so now there are increasing numbers of these conservation parks where you can see captive bird pandas like running around trying to be wild pandas. Which again, it's cool and all, but like, I don't know that it's saving the species.
Step one. What's step two?
Yeah, exactly. And again, like you aren't going to worry about step two until you get step one down yet.
Yeah.
So that's definitely where they are. They're like, why do we need conservation land? We can't even raise and breed pandas. So like they got that part now. They have like a zillion baby pandas. Okay. When its population gets below minimum viable population size, they lose genetic and functional diversity, and it can lead to a positive feedback loop of ever decreasing population size and negative population growth. That would cause an extinction vortex. And that once you pass minimum viable population size, you're prone to genetic drift. You can have a random loss of individuals from a natural disaster, and that will put you at an even smaller population size that has an even bigger allele effect. And then you will have an even smaller population size, and even less chance of reproducing successfully, and then you will go extinct. And positive feedback loops are when you have a system that is constantly pushing itself in one direction. And that happens when you get to small population sizes in certain life history organisms and that are prone to the allele effect. They get small populations, they get smaller, they just keep getting smaller until you have to step in. The California condor is an excellent example of this. California condor is one of these giant raptors. It looks a lot like a turkey vulture that lives in the southwestern United States. And they got overhunted, they had habitat degradation. Johnny Cash accidentally started a bushfire and killed like 50 of them in the 1950s.
Dang it.
And
Did
they
that happen in telephone wires and stuff too?
probably, I mean, yeah, it's all the normal things that happen with these types of animals happen to the California condor like simultaneously. DDT can reduce their reproductive rate. And so we captured the last like 25 of them and put them in captivity and have been hand rearing them since then. And so we've actually been able to rebuild their population to to about 200 individuals to where we can release captive bred California condors back into the wild. And they have, again, kind of like in China, they have this crazy system where they have these like sock puppets that look like adult California condors so that the babies never actually interacted with humans and thus they wouldn't have any human captivity bias. They've been able to stave off the extinction vortex. But again, we still have to keep captively breeding these guys. It's not like we have met minimum viable population size in the wild yet. And that's like 40 years of conservation effort, really intensive breeding, which is cool. Also bad. Okay. Knowing minimum viable population size is really helpful in species conservation. Often along with it comes with knowing the minimum dynamic area, the MDA. And so minimum dynamic area is the minimum home range, the minimum geographic area that a species needs in order to maintain a minimum viable population size. Like, what is the size of land that we need to have habitat protected for this species to make it? What we see time and time again is that the bigger the reserve, the bigger the big piece of land we can have, the bigger population it can support. And there's lots of debate in conservation biology between having several small preserves or single large preserves. And this type of data indicates that the single large preserve is better for actually maintaining population. And in maintaining a large area, you can often protect not just one species, but several species at the same time. And so the single large tends to win out when it comes to the science and the data and the understanding, but that has to be balanced by what's actually possible in a community, and that you may not be able to purchase or maintain a single large preserve. You may need to purchase several small ones and try to have them connected so that G-flow can be maintained, so that both people and organisms can utilize the environment well. Does that make sense? The edge of Appalachia Preserve is an excellent example of that in our region. So southeastern Ohio has a very, very large nature preserve that's held by the Nature Conservancy. And they have purchased ever-increasing parcels of land along their boundaries in order to increase the size of the preserve, so that some of the endemic kind of rare species of this side of the Appalachian Mountains can have a territory, a home range that's protected there. They're constantly trying to link up with the national forests in the region to increase the size of the overall preserve and conservation lands for these different types of organisms. But that is hard to do. What started out as several small individual conservation areas is becoming a large single conservation land management area. But it is hard to do. There's lots of red tape and there's lots of expense to being able to do it well. Cool. All right. The other thing that can help with knowing dynamic area and minimum viable population size is that you can predict when a subpopulation or a species is going to need help, when it's okay, when you need to take them into captivity, when you need to group together marmot colonies and force them to interbreed. And so this is data looking at bighorn mountain sheep, and they can look at different percentages of the population that are going to persist at different herd sizes. And so when the herd size is 100 or more individuals, they have an almost 100% chance of persisting for more than 50 years. But when their herd size gets to be less than 15 individuals, it's almost assured that that herd will go extinct in 50 years. And so this is the idea that you can take those 15 individuals and move them into a larger herd. Or perhaps those are the individuals that you capture and you put into captivity in order to maintain a zoo population, because they're going to go extinct anyways. And so we need to do something about them if we want to change the outcome for that herd. There is lots of debate in this type of conservation biology about whether or not you should take these types of actions, and that you can predict, you can know that an action needs to be taken or they will go extinct. And then there's lots of questions about should we? Like, just because we can move them, just because we can capture them all, should we do that? Is this a natural extinction process? Or is this something that's man-made and that we want to change the fate of these organisms? And I don't know that I have good response for that question for every type of organism. And definitely those are conversations that not only scientists need to be having about their data and what they think is ethically right, but that has to include the community where these sheep live, okay? We can't walk up to the sheep and be like, hey, do you want to move in with your cousin Joe? Do you want to go to the zoo or do you want to die? Okay, like we can't like question these organisms. We have to make decisions for them, and we need to be really smart and savvy about our decisions. Or we tend to make them wrong.
And there are organisms which you just extinct on purpose.
Oh yeah, totally.
Like they released like some biogenetically like engineered mosquitoes to lay infertile eggs.
Yes, they did.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. I don't know how I feel about that one. Like I'm excited that we might be able to halt the spread of some of our infectious diseases that these mosquitoes carry. Like that's why we're doing it, because we don't want malaria, we don't want Zika to like get further out. But like a tiny bit of me feels bad for the mosquitoes.
I
Like a
just feel
tiny
bad.
small bit.
Yeah.
I feel bad for the bats.
Right, exactly. Like there are other organisms that rely on mosquitoes. And so I'm kind of interested to see what the impact actually is.
Probably be fine.
Yeah.
They said it'd be fine.
I'm not too worried about them as mosquitoes.
They don't actually offer much nutrients anyways.
No, but for some organisms, during certain times of the year, they're the dominant prey item because they're so ridiculously abundant that they're a pest. For us, they're major food items for other organisms. And so, like, that means that those other organisms are going to have
More
to
of
shift.
something else.
Yeah, they're going to eat more of something else. And, like, that could be good too. Like, maybe they'll eat other types of pests too. Don't know. And I don't know how to test that well other than just, like,
Let's see what
releasing them
happens.
into the
Yeah.
wild and seeing what happens. And like, if it turns out great, awesome, we fixed the problem. If it turns out crappy, well, that's another thing in the fuck up problem, right? Like, I don't know how to, they've tested them in the lab. They feel sure that it'll maintain itself over a couple generations. They feel sure it's not going to gene hop into another organism and cause something else to go infertile. But like, what the ecosystem impact is, I don't know that we can adequately model that. Again, I'm not sure in this case that I want them to not do it just because.
I think that is.
We won't know until we know.
Yeah, I won't know till now. Okay. I'm ready to leave competition between individuals of the same species. And I want to talk a little bit for the rest of the next 2 classes or so, 3 classes, about interactions between members of different species that have very similar niches or niches. Okay, like you can say it either way. It's okay with me. I'll probably say different ways on different slides. I honestly can't remember what my, ecology professor said, if it was niche or niche. I remember, yeah, I'm like, it could be quiche.
It could be silent.
Yeah.
It could be ish. Silent in.
A niche is the range of physical and chemical conditions that a species needs to survive and reproduce. It is its essential array of resources. And so a niche encompasses everything that an organism needs to grow and survive and reproduce. We think about a habitat as the geographic area that an organism lives and grows and reproduces in, and that contains its resources. A niche expands that understanding to include interactions with other organisms. It's not just the environmental resources and conditions that it needs, a certain temperature range, a certain amount of moisture. It's also the prey that it needs. It's also the mates that it needs. It's its territory size. And so a habitat is part of an organism's niche, but a niche is a greater encompassing of resources and conditions that an organism needs to grow and reproduce and survive. We talk about 2 things in terms of niches for organisms. And again, we tend to think of this not just on an individual basis, but as a species or a population. And the first understanding of niche is a fundamental niche. And a fundamental are the environmental conditions that are necessary for a species to grow and reproduce. It is its evolutionarily adapted environmental tolerances. The fundamental niche sets the places where an organism can and cannot exist at a fundamental basic starting level. If you can't live in salt water, your fundamental niche is not in the ocean. Okay? It's those very basic tolerances that are set by the genetic content of an organism. A fundamental niche seems very intuitive, but it turns out that it's actually a theory because it's not reality. A fundamental niche is only the environmental resources. It does not include predation. It does not include competition. It does not include territoriality. And so it's theoretically what's set. And so it encompasses lots of places that organisms actually can't get to. Okay, it's a theory. When we talk about a fundamental niche, we often talk about an n-dimensional hypervolume that is set by all these different environmental tolerances for these different conditions. Your temperature range combined with salinity puts you in a particular box where you can live in possible environmental conditions. When we add on to that pH, we get a depth to the box. Okay. When you then add on precipitation that's necessary, you go to 4 dimensions of the box in hyperspace where you can be, okay, as a species. And this way, every little thing that determines where you can and cannot live adds another kind of barrier or side to this fundamental niche, this place where you can live. And so for some organisms, it's relatively well understood what defines them in terms of their fundamental niches. For other organisms, there's lots of times questions why we're like, why does it live here and not over here? And then we come to find out, oh, it needs a different nitrogen concentration, or oh, phosphorus levels aren't enough, or magnesium actually is really important for this organism. Okay, does everybody get that? The second part of this is what happens in reality, and that is an organism's realized niche. And the realized niche is the place where the species actually lives. Your realized niche is that portion of your fundamental niche that organisms actually have access to and can exploit. And it's very rare that a species lives across all of its fundamental niche possibilities. Usually we find it living in a subset or a portion of all the possible places where it could live. And that is its realized niche. That is what actually happens out in the real world. And most often, that fundamental niche has been confined to a smaller area, their realized niche, by biological interactions with other organisms. And competition is one of those things that reduces a fundamental niche to a realized niche. And it can happen between individuals of the same species. Like in territoriality, your fundamental niche is your entire home range. Your actual realized niche is the territory you defend. Okay, that's set by your biological interaction. This happens very interestingly between species that have overlapping fundamental niches too. And that 2 different species that have similar fundamental needs will compete with each other and push each other into a portion of their fundamental niche, into their realized niche. Okay. And so in this instance, we have 2 different species, an orange and a green one. In the absence of the other species, they'll exist in different portions of this, say, water or nitrogen gradient. Okay, this orange species has a little lower tolerance, but species 2 can do better at higher resource concentrations. If you grow them alone, separately. If you put these 2 species together, this is their fundamental niche. Okay, when you put them together, you get a realized niche for each of them. Okay, when you grow them together in combination, they compete with each other for resources. And in the portion of their fundamental niche where they overlap, you'll get an interaction from competition. You'll get depressed population of both. Okay. It pushes species 1 to being higher abundance at lower resource levels because it can live at lower resource levels. It pushes species 2 into areas that have higher resource levels because they do better at higher resource levels where species 1 can't live to begin with. Okay, it confines them over the totality of their range to just a subset of that for each of them. Okay. Does that make sense?
Is there generally more of a separation when you introduce more species, or is it ever like
Yes.
coming together?
So it can happen both ways. Usually, like this is evolution and competition, natural selection acting to separate populations due to resource limitation and interactions. You can have
Like
another
a
scenario.
symbiosis, like what if they
Yeah.
merge?
Yep, they can merge into one. That can happen too. We tend to see more examples in nature of this specialization and what we're going to call resource partitioning, because that tends to be better for both species. But we don't see often populations that are in the process of merging. We just see the end result of that merge, right? As like species A. We didn't see it as species B and C before it merged. So unless you catch one of these populations in the act of merging, it's hard to know that like, hey, they merged. Okay. That's kind of the deal. There's an observation bias to it. Okay. A nice example of realized niches, a lot of this work has been done in rocky intertidal zones as well as in marsh grasses. This is an environment where there's an automatic gradient of water. And based upon an organism's ability to withstand desiccation to live out of the water, we see that different organisms have different fundamental niches. And then when they compete for space along the water line, you get this interaction that produces very different realized niches from what their fundamental niche might be. We find them living in only a portion of the area in which they could exist. And so here again, we have these two different types of marsh grasses. They both can live in the water as well as out of the water. It turns out that this guy, the dark green species here, cannot live in very deep water, okay? They both can live up on land and where it's shallow, but this guy can't live farther down. And this guy does a lot better than the light green guy in the shallower depths. It's a better competitor for resources. As a result then, the dark green guy competes and outcompetes the other species until it gets too deep. And then the light green species can live there. The light green species can live all the way along this gradient of moisture and water depth, but we only actually find it living here due to competition with the dark green. It's pretty cool. We see all these types of gradients of species distribution across environmental resource abilities due to both their fundamental tolerances for different resources and then due to competition, and we're going to layer onto that predation in a couple of weeks too. It's not just the conditions, it's also the biology that causes the overall distribution and density of organisms. Okay, so we can start on this. This might be kind of where I leave off for us. We'll see. I do have 10 minutes, but I'm always like pushing it for the end of the class.
We gotta start on time today.
I know, I did a better job of ending my other class. Getting started on time. We'll see. Did it take me 9 weeks? Yes.
Is okay.
It's the way it goes. Well, it should go way better. It's very exciting. I have too many things to say. So this is interspecific competition when we see realized niches in organisms. This is due to competition between members of different species. And usually this competition occurs between species that have very similar fundamental niches that use the same resources. And so they have to compete for them, whether that's light or space or water, phosphorus, a prey item. They are competing with each other. In this instance of interspecies competition, competition tends to be negative for both species, both individually as well as in terms of range that they inhabit and population size that they have, overall growth rate, reproduction. We talked about how competition within your species can be a plus minus for you, depending upon if you get resources. It can be a plus minus for your population, if it hurts you or helps you stabilize population. In the case of interspecies competition, it's pretty much negative. Okay, if those people, that competitor wasn't there, you would do better, individually as well as population. The same things happen for populations of competing species as for within a species. We see that the consequences are that we have decreased reproduction, you have less access to resources, your offspring may not grow and survive because somebody else's offspring did. We see decreased growth rate, again, because of stress, lack of access to resources, increased dispersal. Just as you're competing, within your species, you can have the same hormonal changes due to competing with members of similar species. It really changes your survival and mortality. And that if you, again, weren't competing, you would have a higher survival rate. If you are competing, it increases your mortality, lowers your survival. It has evolutionary consequences too. Interspecies competition is a natural selective force. It selects those organisms that are best adapted to the place where you actually can live. It selects for, very often, species that move out of competition with another organism. Okay? If you can avoid competition, you will be better adapted. You will have less consequences of competition. It can happen at the level of actually evolutionary adaptation. It can be an acclimatization, developmental plasticity scenario too, when it comes towards the consequences of interspecies competition. There are 6 mechanisms and kind of behaviors, I think you can say, that we see 2 species that are competing with each other can display. And so I'll introduce a couple of these today, and then we'll start with this next Thursday. We talked about how there are these different types of competition. These happen when we had 2 different species that are competing for resources. So the first one is consumption competition. It's when one species inhibits another by consuming a shared resource, like that is your food item or your water. And that in you eating it, you have gained access to it and you deny it to another species. Here we have a whole bunch of different species that are competing for access to the watering hole. That is consumption competition. The elephant drinking a lot denies water to the zebra and the antelope. It is a shared resource. The elephants are competing with each other. At the same time, they're competing with the zebras and antelopes. And so consumption competition can play in both inter and intra-species competition. And again, it's this idea of kind of somewhere on the line between scramble and contest competition. You might all be scrambling for access. When the resource is used, it's not available for everybody else, but you can definitely win access to a bigger piece of the resource. It definitely falls along with exploitation competition in that once you have used it, it's not available to somebody else. The next type of interspecies competition is preemption. And preemption is when your presence or occupancy at a place excludes or preempts the presence of another. So because the mussel is growing here on the rock, the barnacles can't, and vice versa. That is competition for space between different species, and it is preemption. Because you have set that as your territory, somebody else can't do it. Because the lion pride is hunting in that area, the hyenas cannot. That's preemption. It very often happens in sessile organisms like plants and these types of stationary invertebrates for space competition. In plants, it's really a lot about light competition. Because you're there and I've got my leaves out, I've denied you access to light. I have preempted your ability to gain access to that resource. The third one is overgrowth. And overgrowth is when one species grows on top of another in order to inhibit their access to a resource. And so it's like taking preemption to the next level and saying, you might have established, but I can get taller, faster, bigger, quicker. And I'll push you out as a result. And that's definitely what happens lots of times with mussels and barnacles, is that the mussel sits down and starts to grow, it pushes out the barnacles around it, even though they had managed to lay Definitely, it happens all the time in plant competition. And that, this is the classic fast, quick growing species versus the slow growing guy. And that the taller plants will shade out the shorter ones. So if you, in an open bare patch of ground, the first winners of competition are the ones that establish and grow tall fast. They'll be outcompeted eventually by the slow growing, even taller organisms. But in the meantime, they're going to win for a short period of time. We see this all the time in all types of epiphyte organisms. So epiphytes are plants that grow on top of other plants. They're kind of established a niche to overgrow on top of other types of established plants. Okay, cool. I will leave it there. We'll pick up with the other three, and we will talk about the math